It is October 16th, 2025, and President Trump is describing the phone conversation that he just had with Russian President Putin as lengthy and productive, noting that they have plans to meet coming up in person in Budapest. But if you look at the Russian side and what they had to say about the meeting, they said that Putin directly warned Trump over the possibility that the U.S. would approve long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles for the war against Russia. Noted that, look, these are not going to change the balance of power on the battlefield, but that they would completely derail all of the progress that the U.S. and Russia have made since Trump came into office earlier this year. So is Trump actually going to listen to that warning? Well, that's the big question right now, as he is set to welcome Zelensky to the White House on Friday. So what does all of this mean? Yeah, I want to get your take on the latest here, as President Trump announced that he had a lengthy and productive conversation with Russian President Putin today, in which they agreed to a meeting of high-level advisors next week and to a follow-up meeting in person between the two of them in Budapest. Now, we know that Zelensky is set to meet with Trump at the White House on Friday. Trump has been publicly saying, even threatening, the approval of long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles for the war against Russia, but that's not something that he's mentioned since he's been talking about this conversation with Putin. So how do you view the current state of tension?
Well, obviously, I have not read the text of the meeting, so at least I do not know what was actually discussed. What we know is that the last time there was a meeting in Anchorage, that President Trump and his team showed up and expected to overwhelm their Russian guests with charm and hospitality, but they came with without any proposals, and they weren't prepared to discuss the proposals the Russians had made. And so the Russians said very well, and they outlined once again their position. And there was no discussion because the Russians have made it very clear what they think and what they want. In other words, I think President Putin had hoped that we would read carefully and study carefully what they'd said so that we could come in and say, well, we studied 10 points. We're comfortable with the first 6. We're not comfortable with these 4. We'd like to talk about those and find out if there's any flexibility in those. But that didn't happen. Now, perhaps this time there's a willingness to do that. If there is, that would be good news. But thus far, President Trump seems to be most influenced by the last advisor he speaks to. And the last advisor he speaks to inevitably urges him to be tough and hard and, quote unquote, stand up to the Russians, and reminds him that we are the most powerful nation in the world, and ultimately they have to do what we want. Well, that's all nonsense, as you and I know. But unfortunately, that's where we've been in the past. So all we can do at this point is hope for the best. And the best would be a substantive discussion of what the Russians have proposed, because I think they would appreciate that. That demonstrates that we actually care what they think, that we respect their national strategic interests. We've never done that. We've acted as though they have no legitimate political interests whatsoever, or national security interests in Ukraine, which is nonsense. So that's about as far as I'm willing to go. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, it's shocking, isn't it, when you look at the Trump administration's handling of this, given the fact that, we could be looking at the possibility of nuclear war, or at the very least, a sharp increase in tensions. And I do want to get into the Tomahawk conversation a little bit, because I know that Zelensky is on his way to the White House. He's going to be pushing for it. And as Russian President Putin has been pointing out, he's like, look, if the U.S. introduces Tomahawks into this war, it's not going to change the balance of power on the battlefield. The U.S. apparently doesn't even have that many to send, but it will show Russia that the U.S. military is directly involved in each attack on Russian soil, because that is what is required. So why then do you think we've even had a conversation about Tomahawks being introduced into this conflict, and that it has been front and center for the last few weeks now?
Somebody mentioned it to President Trump. President Trump really knows nothing about the Tomahawk missile. Perhaps he knows something now, and he suddenly realized that the Tomahawk is by no means a silver bullet. The Tomahawks come in three variants. One is air delivered or air launched, the other is sea launched. Those are not usable on the ground in Ukraine. In other words, the only way they could be launched would be if we provided bombers and air power to launch directly at the Russians. So the only real option is a ground launched missile system. Now, that system is very unique. It's very different from the other missiles insofar as the warhead is concerned. I can't go into great detail about it, but it's a 3,300-pound warhead, which it packs an enormous punch, but it has to be fired from the back of a truck. Now, there is a possibility that you could put the system into a 40-foot container. The container could be loaded onto a rail car or be on a barge in a river, I suppose. But in the final analysis, and this is what I think President Putin may have stated very categorically to President Trump, and hopefully he listened, the Russians are not stupid. We are going to have to conduct the mission planning and execution. In other words, you're going to have U.S. military personnel on the ground, presumably from the U.S. Army, or contractors from Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, or Americans not in uniform, temporarily not on active duty. I mean, whatever you could do, but it has to be American. And the Russians will regard that as an act of war and respond accordingly. Now, I'm sure that President Trump did not say that in a state of rage or uncontrolled passion, because that's not his way of doing business. I think he just said very straightforwardly, we will treat this as an act of war. And there's always the outside possibility that you could mount a nuclear warhead on a Tomahawk. It would be a bad idea, but President Trump has not stated categorically that we will not initiate a nuclear strike. He should, and make that abundantly clear right up front. That would help enormously. And finally, as you point out, we estimate that we have between 20 and 50 missiles that we could fire. Presumably, these are the ground-launched variants, and that's not very much. And the probability is very high that Russian integrated air defenses would shoot most, maybe even all of them down. But the problem is, what do you do if one gets through? What do you do if it strikes a nuclear power station? What do you do if it falls on a civilian population? Even if you planned it to do other things, those things can happen, and the consequences for that kind of action are severe. So hopefully President Trump now understands that clearly and has been willing to reconsider. But again, I don't know who he's going to send, who's going to speak for the administration. I haven't seen much evidence for anybody in this White House. I wasn't very impressed with the last bunch, but I don't know that we have anybody in this administration who is really qualified to talk in detail about these kinds of things. So we'll have to see. At least it's encouraging insofar as it postpones another stupid decision with stupid consequences.
Yeah, as you're describing it there, I'm going, of course, Russia would see that as an act of war, right? Of course, Russia is watching the US continue to escalate. And I know that, Putin typically has a very measured approach of kind of letting him know, hey, we're pointing it out to you that we see exactly what you're doing. But as you're also describing there, a statement from Trump, he mentioned Secretary of State Marco Rubio is leading the delegation of high-level advisors that's set to happen next week. Don't look at Marco Rubio and have confidence that we're ever going to see a reduction in war. I look at him as a hothead who's going to take us to more and more war. Given that, and given the fact that you have Zelensky coming to the White House tomorrow, what are your concerns for the ways in which the Trump administration could still latch on to escalating this, even as we do have these talks with Russia coming up?
We have never recognized Russia's legitimate national security interests in Ukraine. We've treated the Russians as though they have no right to defend themselves. We've pretended that what's happened in Ukraine is an accident of history which is of no interest to us. We have never accepted responsibility for this regime and the terrible things that it's done, not only to the Russians, but its own people. And we have never stated categorically that, yes, we've had a hand in planning and executing most of the failed ground operations in Ukraine, which has cost the Ukrainians 1.7 to 1.8 million dead in Ukrainian uniform. So I don't know what we can expect. Senator Rubio is an intelligent man. He's not stupid, but he is an acolyte of Bill Kristol's. And Bill Kristol is a very prominent neocon and probably globalist. It's the same school of thought, essentially. So I don't know what we can expect. Again, as I said earlier, I don't know who else is going to be part of the delegation. But if we're going to go in there and make demands and reject the idea that what happens in Ukraine is existential to Russia and not to us, I don't know how far we're going to get.
Yeah, when you have the U.S. acting as though, the government in Kiev just kind of fell apart in 2014. We don't know what happened, when they know exactly what happened. And that brings me to the next conflict that I want to bring up here, because I know that Trump also confirmed on Wednesday that he has authorized the CIA to conduct covert action in Venezuela, and said he's considering strikes on Venezuelan territory. Are we headed for, I know he's talking about all of this peace right now, but it sounds like we're headed for another war here. Is that how you see it?
Yes. No one is asking hard questions about the real purpose of American military action against Venezuela, or the potential strategic impact on the United States, good or bad. Most people in the Senate seem to privately think, well, Venezuela could be an opportunity for Washington to recover trillions in wealth squandered on failed U.S. military interventions in the Middle East and Ukraine. In fact, when I listen to people talk about Venezuela, they sound as though they're ready to climb into their Viking boats, sail down to Venezuela, steal everything that they need and want, without regard to what happens to the population. Because all they talk about is Venezuela's oil and gas, its gold mines, its emerald mines. There isn't much discussion, frankly, on the Hill or inside the Beltway about the alleged role that Venezuela plays in drug and human trafficking, because, frankly, it's very small. Colombia is much more heavily involved, as is Mexico. So the notion that we're going there is going to have some sort of impact on drug trafficking that will benefit us is very much open to debate. I guess the bottom line is, if you go back, you'll find out that Paul Wolfowitz, in testifying to Congress, said that Iraq's oil would ultimately pay for the war and the occupation of Iraq. None of that happened. It was a complete failure. And we went into the hole to the tune of trillions of dollars. So I think anybody who asserts that we can arbitrarily enter that country or bully that country with the goal of taking their resources and getting away with it is very wrong. I also worry about the ramifications in Latin America. We're not exactly popular in Latin America. We can go through that history. I don't think going into Venezuela will help us. In fact, I think it could become a cause around which much of Latin America rallies. We end up dealing with hundreds of thousands of paramilitaries from various parts of South America, including Brazil and Colombia, that'll pour in there to help fight us. And I'm not talking about weapons designed to sink ships at sea. I'm talking about letting us come into the country and then killing us in great numbers the longer we stay there. I don't know, but I don't see any evidence for clear thinking. I don't see any evidence for debate. I do see a lot of evidence that the CIA is very, very excited about this and strongly supports it.
Yeah, the CIA is like, finally, we get to do something. Well, I say new as if they haven't been targeting Venezuela for a number of years now, but they at least get a new version of the operation. And as you're describing it there, I'm also reminded of a recent Politico article in which they quoted their anonymous officials who said that the Trump administration was very intentionally using these allegations of drug trafficking to paint Nicolas Maduro as a terrorist, as the head of a drug cartel, in the hopes that it would get the MAGA movement on board, that they would pass right through the no more wars, I'm going to end the wars, and go towards, drug trafficking, concerns about our border here in the US, and hop on board with it. How do you see that potential strategy and really what it means for the American people who have said, look, we don't want more endless wars? And it sounds like that's another one that the U.S. could be getting directly involved in.
Oh, I don't think there's any question about that. Let's go back and reflect on some things. But in the mid 90s, late 90s, we became enamored with this notion of regime change. We directed it initially in Bosnia Herzegovina at the Serbs. Subsequently, we resumed this process in Kosovo. All of it was designed to remove Milosevic. As you'll recall, he was the cause celeb at that point. And we thought that we would end up running Yugoslavia the way, we ran the Philippines, with some governor general sitting in Manila, only this time he would sit in Belgrade. None of that worked. It cost us a lot of money. And even though we had very smart people in the Clinton administration who opposed this, one of whom was Secretary of Defense Perry, who said, let us not get involved in anything which requires us to maintain a permanent ground military presence. That's exactly what happened. And we have been caught up in this web of deceit and stupidity in the Balkans ever since. And you move on beyond that. It wasn't enough to go into Afghanistan and remove or kill Osama bin Laden and his crew. No. We had to go in there and take over the country. We had to remove everyone who was in power. And then the country would improve and get better and ultimately become a feather in our caps. And we all know how that ended. Simultaneously, we go to Iraq, and again, we have to remove the regime. It wasn't enough to say, give us, Saddam Hussein's head, and you 3 or 4 generals, you're now in charge of the country, and you'll coordinate with the United Nations for elections, and we'll help you as we can. But no. We had to dismantle the government, dismantle the army, dismantle the administration. We all know how that worked out. And we wanted the same thing under Biden when it came to Russia. It was not enough to find a solution that would end this terrible war. No, on the contrary, we wanted the war because the war was supposed to remove President Putin from power. And in fact, that wasn't enough. We wanted to effectively rape Russia, steal its resources, divide it, balkanize it. That hasn't worked. So we then turned our attention to supporting Israel in its bid to destroy Iran. But the real point in Iran was, once again, regime change and then balkanization. Turn Iran into some imitation of Syria or, destroyed Lebanon. And now we're talking about Venezuela. Why do we want to remove the regime? Because the regime is a heinous criminal that is killing millions of Americans? No, that's nothing to do with it. Seems to be all about resources. And that's why I said go back and remember that in March of 2003, Paul Wolfowitz, who was then Deputy Secretary of Defense, assured Congress that Iraq, through its oil revenue, would pay for everything, pay for reconstruction, pay for our occupation, pay for the war. I think we're headed down the same road. And the only solution, I think, is for the American people to throw everybody out of office who sits in Washington, because I don't know what else you can do.
Yeah, at this point, I don't know that there's any fixing them or any solving this problem with the current people that are there, because they've learned how to play the game. And clearly, as you're noting there, they have a blueprint that they use time and time again. Now, while I have you here, I do want to get into Iran a little bit, because I know we have ongoing concerns that the US and Israel are preparing for the next phase of war against Iran, especially as there's now a ceasefire in Gaza, as you have Trump declaring the war against Hamas over, at least for the moment. What are your concerns about the U.S. engaging in further war against Iran? And is that something we could see as early as Christmas of this year?
Well, first, let me touch briefly on the ceasefire. I don't think the ceasefire is even turning out to be a pause. That was about the most that you could expect from it. The notion that we're going to now enrich the Trump family, Mr. Kushner, Witkoff, or anybody else involved in the reconstruction of, Gaza, which really amounts to turning it into some sort of Las Vegas-like destination. I think the probability of those things ever happening is very low. But I do think people have actually maintained those fantasies. But I don't think this ceasefire is going to last. And we already had, within the first 24 hours, 7 Palestinians killed. The Israelis were trying to withhold aid, and only under great pressure have they allowed 600 trucks to move aid and sustenance into Gaza. I don't think this war in Gaza is over. And as I said, we might see a pause, but that's about the most that you can expect. In the meantime, President Trump has stated, I think just within the last couple of hours, that if the people of Gaza won't respect this ceasefire, and I don't know why he said that, but he did, then he says, I guess we'll have to kill them all, which of course is very Stalin-like. Stalin believed in prophylactic justice. Kill the citizen before the citizen gets a chance to commit a crime. That's what it sounds like he wants to do in Gaza, which may be music to Mr. Netanyahu's ears, but I think is reprehensible from the standpoint of an American citizen. I can't imagine why anybody would want that. Now, having said all that, let's now touch on Iran. The preparations for war with Iran continue, both on the U.S. and the Israeli side. We are positioning assets at sea, air assets in close proximity, concentrating tankers, all the kinds of things that we've seen in the past. So I think there is a very definite readiness for war. Now, what's the pretext for war with Iran? I don't know. Is it going to be a false flag? I mean, we certainly saw that twice in Syria that precipitated cruise missile launches into the desert sands there back when President Trump was in office the first time. Rachel, I don't know, but I think it's going to happen. I'm a little surprised it hasn't happened already, but maybe we had a pause here so that President Trump could burnish his credentials for a future Nobel Peace Prize. I don't know. But I don't think we're going to get to Christmas without this war. Now, there are other opinions. Alistair Crook has suggested, given the weather, that Israeli air power might not be as effective over the winter, and therefore they may wait longer. I don't know, because Mr. Netanyahu's in a difficult position. His popularity in Israel is one thing, but Israel's position with the American people has certainly deteriorated. I don't think a complete break with Israel is by any means in the offing, but he's got to sit back and begin to ask the question of how long can I get away with this unconditional support from the United States? How many people can I ultimately control through whatever means, money and otherwise, on the Hill? I don't know the answers to those questions, but I'm sure he's asking those. So, yeah, I think it has to happen before Christmas. But, I could be wrong and they could wait longer.
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of see that back and forth there. And I'm with you. It feels like they're preparing for something sooner rather than later. The last thing I want to get into is just kind of the state of the American people, because as we've been talking about through this conversation, I mean, you've got Iran, Venezuela, still an ongoing proxy war against Russia, still neocons who want war with China, and so on and so forth, and then adding Gaza back in. And the American people, they're looking around and going, okay, it's almost been a year since the majority of them voted for the guy who told them no new wars, right? I'm going to stop the wars. And even now, Trump is kind of playing this charade of, oh, I've got, 6 or 7 peace deals. He's apparently solving conflicts that we didn't know existed. And he's still trying to keep that as the public front. I don't know if that all goes away just because he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, but how do you view the state of the American people and kind of their awareness about what their government is continuing to do, no matter who they vote into office?
I think the American people are aware of rising inflation. I think they're aware that the economy is fragile, though they may not understand the particulars or the details. They're looking at their way of life. They're looking at the criminality. Contrary to popular belief, I think lots of Americans who live close to large cities and have experienced criminality are welcoming many of the things that President Trump wants to do. But even those things don't come across as well planned, well orchestrated. I haven't seen President Trump take to the airways and try to build support for the policies he wants to follow. I think he likes rallies. He likes to go to rallies and interact with people that cheer him, make flippant remarks, exaggerate things, get into the plane and go home. I mean, that's kind of what he does. What he really needs to do now is the kind of thing that, frankly, FDR did in the late 30s, which is explain, why are we doing what we are doing? Why are we going to help the British? Why are we taking the actions we are against Japan? All this sort of business. It never happened. It never happens now. It needs to. So that's Problem number one. But there's something else here that we can't lose sight of, Rachel. And you're down there in San Antonio. You know this better than I do. Most Americans do not pay much attention to what happens beyond their borders. And most Americans think that war is something that happens on somebody else's soil. The possibility that they could be drawn into something and that they could suffer, their families could suffer, their cities, their towns could suffer, I don't think they believe that. So it worries me a great deal, because we could end up in this seemingly minor intervention in Venezuela that turns into a giant quagmire. But that's the kind of quagmire that could visit us here at home. And that quagmire could ultimately find common ground with other problems overseas. I mean, if you're Chinese and you're Russian and you're sick of the way that we have been treating them, and in fact, just before we started, I received a note from someone that said that President Trump has announced to everyone that India has agreed not to buy any more oil from Russia. But then the spokesman for the Indian government said, that's nonsense. We're going to buy oil and gas from Russia. We don't know what he's talking about. I don't know what's going on in the White House. I often think they're disconnected from strategic reality. No one's asking any hard questions. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? What's the purpose? How do we plan to proceed? What's it going to look like when we're through? What's the strategic impact on us? Not next week, not before Christmas, long term. Everything is short fused. President Trump loves optics. That's what you saw in front of the Knesset. He just said, we got a great ceasefire, or everything's coming up roses. We're going to have peace. Everything's going to be wonderful. Then he turns around a day later and says, well, if the Gaza residents aren't going to go along with this, well, then I guess we'll just have to kill them all. Thank you, Joseph Stalin. That's not something I would have expected to hear from an American president or anybody in the Western world. So I don't have a good answer.
Yeah, it's very telling, and I think a good reminder to kind of keep in mind as we're watching Trump, that this is the way he tends to do things. He'll go from one extreme to the next. And so even bringing it back to where we started, looking at the upcoming talks with officials from Russia, an upcoming meeting with Putin, while yes, that looks like it could be a step in the right direction, you also never know. And I think it goes back to what you were saying about these officials living in a bubble here in the US. It's not going to do them well long term. There is certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Retired U.S. Army Colonel Col.macgregor, a defense and foreign policy analyst and former Pentagon advisor. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Sure. Thank you, Ray.